Okay, let's go back to our original equation. We've talked about amplitude. We've talked about frequency. We've talked about phase. The next thing I want to talk about is about the cosine function itself. What's so special about cosine, and how can we move back and forth between cosine and sines? So you already know that cosines start out at 1 and sines start out at 0. And we've already told that as engineers, we much prefer using cosines, and we can convert between the two just by adjusting the phase angle. Let's talk about how we do that. There's a couple of trig rules that you need to know. The first is if you're ever given the sine of any number x, well, that's just the same thing as cosine of x minus 90 degrees. Now, we had just said that in that last whiteboard right over here on the right. So let's formalize that as a rule to remember. This is one of those, not many formulas I ask you to know, but this is a formula I want you to know. And two other formulas that you need to know are that cosines are an even function. That means cosine of negative x is the same thing as cosine of just x. You can see that in our waveform up here. The waveform to the, if we call this x, our cosine of negative x on this side looks just the same thing as our cosine of positive x. And that's what lets this rule be true. Sine, though, is what we call a odd function. So if we look at the mirror hand left of x, as x goes more negative, it equals the negative of the positive sign. Over here, if we extend this out, you can see that as we go to negative regions of sine, it looks exactly like positive sine, just flipped upside down. This is negative on the left, and this is positive on the right. So these rules, these three trig IDs, are things you just need to know. And these you need to memorize. These devote brain cells to. I don't ask you to do that often. There are some other trig IDs that are less important. You may need them for a homework problem, but you do not need to memorize them. And that is that the cosine, there are some other trigonometric IDs. I don't suggest that you memorize these. I certainly have not, and I've never needed to have memorized them in my entire life. But they will let you figure out how to add cosine angles together or add sine angles. And I've written them in kind of a compressed format. When I say plus over minus, what I mean is that the cosine of A plus B is equal to cosine of A cosine of B minus sine of A sine of B. And similarly, the cosine of A minus B is equal to cosine A cosine B plus sine of A sine of B.